Have you ever believed that even in the darkest places, hope can still be found? Today you're about to hear a story where a loyal German shepherd and a weary officer uncover not just a secret, but a miracle hidden in the cold. It's a journey of loss, courage, and the power of new beginnings, one that will touch your heart. Before we begin, tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to know how far this story reaches. And most of all, may your day be filled with warmth, kindness, and a little spark of hope. The small town of Maple Hollow, tucked against the rolling hills of Vermont, awoke under a veil of frost. Dawn spilled gently across the horizon, its pale light filtering through the bare branches of maple and oak trees that lined the quiet streets. The air was sharp, crisp enough that every breath steamed in the cold, and the sidewalks shimmered faintly where dew had frozen overnight. It was the kind of morning that suggested tranquility, yet for one man and his loyal companion, the day was about to change forever. Officer Ethan Cole, 38 years old, moved with steady purpose as he walked the familiar route of his early patrol. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and carried the frame of someone who had once been an athlete but was now carved by years of duty. His short, dark hair carried streaks of silver at the temples, his hazel eyes framed by the kind of lines that hinted at grief as much as experience. His face had the rugged quality of someone who had seen both the ugliness of crime and the fragility of life, but beneath the hardened exterior lay a gentleness that few were allowed to glimpse. Ethan's life had been shaped by loss. 3 years ago, his wife Anna had died in childbirth, leaving him childless and hollow in ways he rarely admitted aloud. It was a wound that never quite healed, one that haunted him in the quiet moments when he looked at families in the park or heard a baby's laugh from afar. At his side trotted his partner, Rook, a 6-year-old German shepherd with a thick coat of black and silver fur that glistened under the faint rays of sunrise. Rook was a large, imposing animal with amber eyes that carried an intensity almost human in their sharpness. His ears stood alert, his gait confident, every movement echoing discipline honed by years of training. Yet beyond the polished exterior of a police K-9, Rook carried the quiet aura of a guardian. He had been assigned to Ethan not long after Anna's death, and in the silence of their shared grief, the man and the animal had forged a bond that went beyond handler and dog. To the department, Rook was valued for his instincts, obedience, and fearlessness. To Ethan, he was something far greater, a silent companion who had pulled him back from the brink of despair more than once. The streets of Maple Hollow were still sleepy at this hour. Houses stood lined neatly with white picket fences, thin trails of smoke curling from chimneys as families stirred to life inside. The crunch of gravel under Ethan's boots was the only sound, save for the occasional whisper of wind. To any outsider, it looked like the most peaceful town in Vermont, a postcard of small-town America. But Ethan knew well enough that evil often chose quiet places to hide. It began with a shift in Rook's demeanor. As they walked past a row of modest 2-story homes with shuttered windows, Rook slowed. His ears perked, his nostrils flared, and his body stiffened with a tension Ethan recognized. Immediately, he stopped, his gloved hand tightening around the leash. "What is it, boy?" Ethan's voice was low but calm, his eyes scanning the familiar stretch of road. To him, nothing looked out of place. Trimmed lawns, frost-dusted mailboxes, a jogger in the distance moving with steady rhythm. But Rook's instincts had never lied. The dog lowered his head and pulled toward a large green dumpster set against the back lot of a row of townhouses. The metal surface was streaked with rust, its lid dented from years of use. Rook's paws scraped against the frozen ground as he circled, his nose twitching frantically. Then he let out a sharp bark, followed by another, each one reverberating through the otherwise still street. Ethan's heart quickened. He had seen Rook react this way to drugs, to explosives, even to hidden suspects before. But this bark carried something different, a deeper urgency that made his stomach tighten. He approached slowly, every instinct on high alert. "Find it, Rook," he commanded. The German shepherd's tail bristled, his gaze fixed unwaveringly on the dumpster. Ethan reached for the handle, his breath visible in the cold air, and with a creak of metal hinges he pulled the lid open. What met his eyes knocked the air from his lungs. Inside, nestled in a torn canvas bag, were 2 newborn infants. Their skin was pale, mottled from the cold, and they were wrapped haphazardly in rags that carried the sour scent of garbage. For a moment, the world seemed to still. Ethan's pulse thundered in his ears as he stared down at them. One of the babies stirred weakly, letting out a soft whimper that broke the silence like a plea for mercy. Ethan's chest constricted with a rush of emotions: relief that they were alive, rage that someone could abandon them so callously, and an ache that pierced deeper than he expected, stirring memories of the child he had lost before he even had a chance to hold. His hands trembled as he reached in, careful as though handling the most fragile glass, and lifted the babies into his arms. Their bodies were feather-light, frighteningly so, their breaths shallow but present. Rook stood rigid beside him, ears pinned, eyes locked on the fragile forms, with an almost reverent stillness. Ethan glanced at his partner. "Stay with me, little ones," he whispered, his voice tight. He turned and hurried to the patrol car parked nearby, the crunch of gravel beneath his boots quick and uneven. Gently, he placed the infants on the back seat, tucking his own patrol jacket around them for warmth. His hand fumbled for the radio clipped to his vest. "Dispatch," he said, his voice steadier than he felt. "This is Officer Cole. We've got a code 1049. 2 infants found abandoned in a dumpster on Birchwood Avenue. Request immediate medical assistance." The words tasted bitter, as though speaking them made the horror more real. As the call went through, the quiet hum of the town pressed in. Ethan sat briefly in the front seat, glancing at the rearview mirror where the small bundle shifted weakly beneath his jacket. Rook climbed into the passenger seat, his amber eyes fixed solemnly on the back seat, ears twitching with quiet vigilance. Ethan let out a shaky breath, anger and sorrow fighting within him. "Who could do this?" he muttered under his breath, more to himself than to anyone else. The question hung heavy in the cabin, unanswered and echoing. But in that moment, Ethan made a silent promise. Not only would he find out who had done this, but he would make sure the children had a chance to live beyond the cruelty that had been forced upon them. The faint sound of approaching sirens began to weave through the morning air, breaking the stillness. Backup and paramedics were on their way. But Ethan knew instinctively that what lay ahead was larger than a single rescue. This was the beginning of something deeper, darker, and far more dangerous than he had ever expected to find on an ordinary morning patrol. Rook tilted his head, eyes softening as though sensing the vow forming in Ethan's chest. The man reached down, placing a hand briefly against the dog's shoulder, grounding himself in the steady presence. "We'll get through this, partner," Ethan murmured. "Whatever it takes." The babies whimpered again, faint cries blending with the rising wail of sirens. Ethan started the engine, ready to meet the emergency team, his heart pounding with urgency. Behind them, the dumpster stood silent, but its secret had been revealed, and nothing in Maple Hollow would ever be the same again. The sirens grew louder as Ethan guided his patrol car through the quiet streets of Maple Hollow, his hands gripping the steering wheel tighter than usual. The babies lay bundled in the back seat under his jacket, their tiny chests rising and falling faintly. A fragile rhythm that Ethan checked again and again in the rearview mirror. Rook sat upright in the passenger seat, ears swiveling, gaze fixed on the back seat, as though the shepherd alone could guard the infants against the cruel world outside. The hospital of Maple Hollow came into view, a low brick building with a faded blue sign and a single emergency entrance glowing under harsh fluorescent lights. It was not a large institution, more a rural clinic expanded over the years, but it had a reputation for dedicated staff who carried more compassion than resources. Ethan pulled up to the emergency bay, where a small team of paramedics waited with a stretcher. He stepped out, carefully lifting the 2 infants in his arms, his breath rising in puffs under the cold morning air. One of the paramedics, a young man named Noah Briggs, hurried forward. Noah was in his late 20s, with sandy blonde hair that curled slightly at the ends, pale blue eyes, and the kind of earnest energy that made him look younger than he was. His build was slim, his movements quick, and though he lacked the seasoned calm of older medics, he made up for it with determination. "We've got them," Noah said, voice brisk but laced with concern. He motioned for Ethan to place the babies onto the stretcher lined with warm blankets. Noah had grown up in Maple Hollow himself, known for being the boy who once ran into traffic to save a stray kitten. That recklessness had softened into compassion as he aged, and his career as a medic was born from that very impulse. Ethan stepped back, his hands reluctant to let go, but he forced himself to release the fragile bundle. As the infants were wheeled quickly inside, he fell into step behind the gurney, Rook pacing beside him, nails clicking against the linoleum floors once they entered. The warmth of the hospital air rushed against his cold skin, carrying with it the faint sterile tang of disinfectant and the heavier scent of coffee that clung to night shift staff. Inside the emergency ward, a woman in scrubs rushed toward them. Clara Hughes, 32 years old, moved with a kind of purposeful grace that spoke of long hours and steady nerves. She was of medium height, with dark auburn hair pulled back into a tight bun, stray strands brushing against a lightly freckled face. Her green eyes were sharp, yet warm, often betraying more empathy than she wished to show. Clara carried herself with a quiet resilience shaped by hardship. 3 years earlier, she had suffered a stillbirth, a wound that had marked her heart, though she rarely spoke of it. That pain had deepened her compassion toward children in her care, and though her colleagues admired her strength, they also knew the shadow behind her tired smile. "What happened?" Clara asked, her voice urgent but controlled. Ethan introduced himself, quickly explaining that the infants had been found abandoned in a dumpster. Clara's jaw tightened at his words, but she didn't let her emotions overwhelm her focus. She gestured for Noah and the other staff to transfer the babies to a prepared station, where incubators hummed faintly, waiting. "We'll stabilize them," she promised, her hands already checking vital signs with practiced precision. Ethan lingered near the doorway, Rook pressed close to his leg. The dog's eyes darted to every corner of the room, but softened whenever they returned to the fragile figures now surrounded by medical staff. Ethan found his gaze caught on Clara, her movement steady, her voice low but encouraging as she directed the team. He recognized in her something he rarely saw in himself anymore, hope tempered by loss, a flame that had nearly gone out but refused to die. When the immediate rush slowed, Clara stepped aside to jot down notes. Ethan approached quietly. "How are they?" he asked, his voice rough. Clara looked at him, searching his face before replying. "Alive. Cold, weak, but alive. We'll need to monitor them closely. Do you know anything about where they came from?" "Not yet," Ethan admitted, glancing down at Rook. "But we'll find out." Clara nodded, her expression softening. "Whoever left them wanted them to disappear," she murmured, almost to herself. "But they didn't count on you, and him." She lowered her gaze to Rook, whose ears twitched at the sound of her voice. Clara reached down tentatively, and the German shepherd allowed her to brush her fingers gently over his head. It was a rare moment. Rook was wary of strangers, but he seemed to sense something different in her, something kindred. Before Ethan could respond, an older doctor entered. Dr. Samuel Whitaker, in his late 50s, had thinning gray hair, round glasses perched precariously on his nose, and a build softened by years of desk work. He was respected for his medical knowledge, but also for his blunt honesty, never one to sugarcoat grim realities. "Officer Cole?" he asked, glancing from Ethan to the babies. "They'll need specialized care soon. This hospital can stabilize them, but if there are complications, they'll have to be transferred to Burlington General." Ethan gave a curt nod. "Do whatever's best for them." Whitaker adjusted his glasses, his gaze narrowing. "Do you have any idea who did this?" "Not yet," Ethan repeated, his voice edged with frustration. Whitaker shook his head, muttering something about cruelty before walking away to supervise. Clara stayed behind, her green eyes following the babies as they were moved to incubators. "They're fighters," she whispered. "Don't let the world take that from them." Ethan studied her, recognizing the weight behind her words. He wanted to ask more about her story, but the timing wasn't right. Instead, he turned his attention back to Rook, who remained rigid, as though still waiting for the next command. A nurse entered briefly, announcing that the police chief had been informed. Ethan knew what that meant. This case was now official, and soon it would no longer be just about him and Rook. There would be detectives, paperwork, and the weight of a town's curiosity. But, for now, none of that mattered. All that mattered were the two fragile lives lying behind glass, fighting to exist. Clara finally turned to him, her voice gentler now. "You look like you've carried more than your share of loss," she said quietly. "But maybe..." Maybe this is a chance for something new. Her words caught him off guard, echoing in the hollow spaces he kept buried deep. He didn't answer, but his silence spoke volumes. As the babies settled, their faint cries blending with the rhythmic hum of machines, Ethan leaned against the wall, exhaustion tugging at his bones. Rook lowered himself to the floor at his side, a steadfast sentinel. For the first time in years, Ethan felt not just the burden of loss, but also the fragile spark of responsibility. 2 lives now tethered to his own, waiting for what came next. The following day broke gray and brittle. The sky hung low with heavy clouds that threatened snow. Maple Hollow, usually alive with chatter of neighbors on their porches or children on their way to school, felt quieter than usual, as though the town itself was holding its breath after news of the abandoned infant spread. The police station, a squat brick building with narrow windows, hummed with restless activity. Ethan sat at his desk, still feeling the weight of what had happened. Files were scattered across the surface, coffee cooling at his elbow, but his attention wandered to the memory of the babies in their incubators. Across the station, his colleagues whispered in tight clusters, curiosity simmering. Yet, Ethan kept his distance. He had never cared much for gossip, and this case was already pressing heavily against the part of him he worked hard to protect. Rook sat sprawled at his feet, head resting on his paws, eyes watchful. The dog's ears twitched with every sound, phones ringing, doors shutting, but his gaze returned to Ethan as if tethered by invisible thread. Ethan leaned down, scratching lightly behind Rook's ear. "We're not done yet, boy," he murmured. "Not even close." A sharp knock at his desk interrupted him. Detective Ava Martinez entered, a woman in her late 30s with sharp features and a no-nonsense air. She had olive-toned skin, dark hair cut in a sleek bob, and dark brown eyes that seemed to slice through pretense. Ava's build was lean, athletic, the result of years spent chasing criminals rather than sitting behind a desk. Known among her peers as methodical and uncompromising, she had grown up in a rough Los Angeles neighborhood, the daughter of immigrants who worked endless shifts just to make ends meet. Her resilience was forged in that crucible, and she carried it everywhere she went. "Cole," she said briskly, dropping a folder onto his desk. "We need to talk. Now." Ethan opened the file. Inside were photographs, the dumpster, the canvas bag, the rags that had wrapped the infants, and then a series of records, a torn scrap of paper with faint handwriting, a receipt from a nearby gas station, and a witness report from an early morning jogger. "They weren't left there randomly," Ava explained, crossing her arms. "The jogger says he saw a dark van parked near the dumpster around 4:30 in the morning. No plates visible. He thought it odd, but didn't stick around long enough to see more." Ethan frowned, flipping through the papers. "So, they wanted to hide them. But why there?" "That's the question." Ava's gaze flicked toward Rook. "And I think your partner might help us with the answer." The suggestion led them outside, where the dumpster still stood, cordoned off with yellow tape. Snowflakes had begun to fall, dusting the ground in delicate specks. Ethan tugged his coat tighter as Rook bounded ahead, nose immediately lowering to the ground. His body stiffened, tail rising. The dog circled, paused, then moved toward a patch of mud near the dumpster's rear. Ethan followed, his boots crunching in the frost. There, pressed into the soft earth, were faint tire tracks. Rook sniffed, growled low in his throat, then trotted further, leading them toward the edge of the lot where the tracks disappeared onto asphalt. Ava crouched, studying the marks. Van, definitely, but the make and model will need surveillance. Back at the station, Ethan and Ava requested security footage from nearby businesses. Hours later, seated in the darkened viewing room, they played back grainy clips until one frame caught their eyes. A black panel van, its windows tinted, rolling past a grocery store camera just minutes before the jogger's report. "It's our vehicle," Ava said, tapping the screen. "Now, we just need to find it." While Ava set up the request for license plate recognition across state databases, Ethan decided to stop by the hospital. His thoughts had lingered there all day, heavy with concern for the infants. Inside the pediatric ward, Clara stood beside the incubators, her auburn hair pulled back, her green eyes weary but alert. The babies were small but stronger than yesterday, their chests rising with steadier rhythm under the glow of warm lights. Clara glanced up when Ethan entered, her expression softening slightly. "They're holding on," she said. Ethan stepped closer, Rook padding quietly at his side. The shepherd's gaze fixed on the incubators, and Clara smiled faintly. "He's protective, isn't he?" "He takes his job seriously," Ethan replied. Before Clara could respond, a volunteer entered the ward. Margaret Fields, a woman in her late 60s, carried a small basket of knitted blankets. Margaret was tall and slender, her white hair pulled into a neat bun, her blue eyes kind but touched with sadness. She was known throughout Maple Hollow as the woman who had lost her only son in a car accident decades earlier. Since then, she had dedicated her life to helping children in need, often knitting blankets and clothing for the hospital's newborns. Her voice was gentle as she approached. "I heard about the little ones. Thought they could use some warmth." Clara thanked her, and Margaret draped the blankets gently inside the ward. Ethan watched her, struck by the quiet devotion in her gestures. People like Margaret were the town's backbone, carrying grief in silence but transforming it into compassion. As the evening drew near, Ava called with updates. The van had been spotted leaving town on a rural road leading north. "It's not random," Ava said over the line. "Whoever abandoned those babies didn't just want to get rid of them. They wanted to disappear." Ethan ended the call, his mind racing. He looked at Clara, who stood watching the babies, her face caught between relief and sorrow. Rook shifted at his feet, ears twitching, gaze unwavering. Something deeper was at play. This wasn't just desperation, it was design. And Ethan knew, with absolute certainty, that the discovery of the infants was only the beginning of a story Maple Hollow was not ready to face. Snow drifted steadily over Maple Hollow as dusk fell, turning the small Vermont town into a blur of white and gray. Street lamps flickered on, their halos casting weak circles through the flurries. At the police station, the hum of activity felt more tense than usual. Word of the abandoned infants had spread, and though the townsfolk whispered quietly in diners and stores, inside the station, the case was becoming heavier, larger, and darker with every lead. Detective Ava Martinez spread files across the conference table, her sharp eyes scanning for details others might have missed. Ethan sat across from her, shoulders squared, jaw tight. Rook lay beside his chair, his body curled yet alert, ears twitching each time a door opened. His amber eyes flicked between his handler and the table, as though he too understood that every paper scattered there meant a piece of the puzzle. Ava slid one document toward Ethan. This came in from state records, old property tax ledgers linked to a family estate north of here. "Look at the name." Ethan leaned forward. Scrawled across the faded ledger was Bennett, a name he had heard before, but never in connection with anything this sinister. The Bennett family had once been among Vermont's wealthiest, their money built from timber and shipping, their name etched into plaques and libraries. But the modern generation had all but disappeared from public life, retreating behind the gates of their estate. Rachel Bennett, Ava said, late 30s, inherited most of the family assets after her parents' deaths. There are whispers she was forced into deals to keep the estate afloat. That's when records start getting messy. Donations to questionable organizations, shell companies popping up. Ethan's brow furrowed. And now, infants dumped in dumpsters in our backyard? Before Ava could reply, the door opened and Chief Harold Mason entered. He was in his early 60s, stocky, with thinning hair and a round face etched by decades of long nights and compromises. Known as a steady leader, he had the voice of a man who had spent years both commanding respect and carrying burdens he couldn't share. "Cole Martinez," he greeted, his deep voice steady. "I just got off the phone with Burlington PD. They've had similar cases, children vanishing from shelters, adoption records going missing. This isn't isolated." Ava crossed her arms. "So, the Bennetts may be tied to a bigger network." Mason nodded grimly. "I want discretion. Maple Hollow isn't ready for scandal tied to one of the state's most powerful families. But we need answers." Quietly. As Mason left, the room hung heavy with his warning. Ethan glanced at Ava. Quiet doesn't keep babies alive. Later that evening, Ethan drove to the hospital again. The snow had thickened, blanketing the town in silence. Inside the pediatric ward, the hum of machines greeted him. Clara Hughes stood at the incubators, auburn hair glowing under the lights, her green eyes softened by fatigue but still focused. The babies were stronger, their small fingers twitching against the blankets Margaret Fields had knitted the day before. Clara turned when she heard footsteps, her expression brightening faintly at the sight of Ethan and Rook. "They've been stable most of the day," she said softly. "They're fighters." Ethan watched the fragile figures behind glass, his chest tightening. "Good. They'll need to be." A sound from the doorway interrupted them. A man in his mid-40s stepped inside, carrying a stack of legal documents. Mark Ellison, the county child services officer, was tall and somewhat gaunt, with sandy hair thinning at the crown and a pair of wire-rimmed glasses perched on his nose. His clothes were neat but worn at the edges, and his voice carried both authority and the weariness of someone who had spent years fighting bureaucracy. Mark had grown up in foster care himself, a fact that fueled both his passion for protecting children and his frustration with the slow-moving system. "I heard about the twins," Mark said, glancing toward the incubators. "They'll be placed under temporary county guardianship until we know more." His tone was professional, but his eyes softened when they lingered on the infants. "God, what kind of person does this?" Clara bristled. "Not just a person. A system that lets children slip through cracks wide enough to swallow them whole." Ethan noted the exchange, but kept silent. He respected Mark's dedication, though he also knew the man's hands were often tied by policies and paperwork. Still, his presence meant the case was officially moving into wider jurisdiction. After Mark left, Clara turned back to Ethan, her expression troubled. "I've seen records disappear before," she admitted quietly. "When I volunteered at the Maple Hollow Children's Shelter years ago, I noticed some adoption files just vanished. No explanation. Kids would be gone, and no one could trace where they ended up. I thought it was clerical error, or maybe negligence. But now—" She trailed off, her eyes fixed on the incubators. Ethan's jaw tightened. "Now it looks like part of something bigger." Rook stirred at his feet, letting out a low growl as if echoing the unease in the room. Clara crouched slightly, reaching out, and Rook allowed her fingers to brush over his fur. "He knows," she whispered. "Animals always do." The evening closed with Ethan walking back out into the snow, Rook at his side. The hospital lights glowed behind them, a beacon against the dark. In Ethan's chest, a storm gathered, rage at the cruelty, grief for what could have been his own child, and a fierce determination that no more children would vanish into silence. The name Bennett had surfaced, whispered from the faded pages of a ledger, but Ethan knew it was only this beginning. Snow lingered thick over Maple Hollow, falling in slow, deliberate flakes that muted every sound in town. By morning, the streets were sheathed in white, and the police cruisers in the lot wore frosty shells. Ethan stood beside his car, rubbing his gloved hands together, his breath clouding the air. Rook sat at his side, nose lifted, catching scents that drifted invisibly through the cold. To Ethan, the day felt heavier than most. The Bennett's name lingered in his mind like a shadow that refused to fade. Detective Ava Martinez approached, her boots crunching through the snow. She carried a thermos in one hand, steam leaking from the lid. "Cole," she said, passing it over, "you look like you need this more than me." Ethan accepted, grateful for the warmth. "Any word on the van?" "Not yet, but we did get a tip," Ava replied, pulling a folded note from her coat pocket. "An informant said there's an old storage warehouse on the north edge of town. Belonged to the Bennetts decades ago, now supposedly abandoned. We should check it." Before long, they were driving toward the outskirts. The road narrowed into icy tracks, fields on either side lying dormant under snow. The warehouse came into view as a hulking silhouette, its siding warped with rust, windows boarded, roof sagging under years of neglect. Yet there was something about it that made Ethan's stomach clench. He stepped out, Rook leaping from the back seat with fluid strength. The German shepherd lowered his head, tail stiff, muscles tensed. His amber eyes scanned the surroundings before his nose pressed to the snow, inhaling deeply. Ethan knew that stance. Rook was locked onto something. "Place looks dead," Ava muttered, pulling her scarf higher around her neck. "Not to him," Ethan replied. They circled the building, snow crunching beneath their boots. Rook tugged sharply toward a side door, whining low. Ethan tested the handle. The rusted metal groaned but gave way under his push. Inside, the warehouse smelled of damp wood and old dust, a sharp tang of oil still lingering from machinery long gone. Their flashlights swept across stacks of forgotten crates, metal beams overhead, and piles of discarded papers. As they moved deeper, Rook's ears shot upright. He barked once, the sound bouncing harshly off the walls. Then he darted ahead, paws skittering against the concrete floor. Ethan followed quickly, heart pounding. The dog stopped at a stack of old filing cabinets shoved against a far wall. His claws scratched against the metal, barking louder now, body vibrating with urgency. Ava joined him, kneeling beside the cabinets. She tugged one drawer open. It squealed painfully, revealing stacks of folders, their edges yellowed with age but meticulously labeled. Names, dates, photographs of children, all tucked neatly into manila envelopes. Ethan's stomach twisted as he flipped through them. Dozens of children. Each record, incomplete, some stamped with adoption notes that led nowhere, others marked with red symbols he didn't recognize. "This isn't just neglect," Ava whispered, her eyes narrowing. "This is deliberate." As they poured through the files, footsteps echoed faintly from the far side of the warehouse. Ethan snapped his head up, hand moving to the weapon at his belt. Rook growled, low and menacing, hackles raised. Out of the shadows stepped a man in his late 20s, wearing a tattered brown coat and work boots caked with mud. His dark hair was unkempt, his face gaunt, eyes shifting nervously. "Wait," the man called, raising his hands. "Don't shoot. I'm not here to fight." Ethan kept his voice hard. "Then you better start talking. Who are you?" The man swallowed, his Adam's apple bobbing. "Name's Caleb Moore. Used to work security here years ago, before the place was shut down. I know what they did in this warehouse." Caleb was tall but hunched, his frame wiry, as though life had worn him down. His voice carried bitterness, the tone of someone who had once trusted the wrong people. "I was told it was just record storage, but then shipments started coming. Files, cash, even kids brought in at night. I didn't stay long after that. I left, but I couldn't forget. When I heard about those babies, I knew it had to be connected." Ava studied him carefully. "Why come forward now?" Caleb's eyes darted to the ground. "Because silence eats at you, and because if they're back at it, more kids will vanish. I can't live with that on me." Ethan exchanged a glance with Ava. Rook, still growling, seemed unconvinced, but Ethan gave a short whistle, easing the dog back. Caleb's information could be exactly what they needed. Ava pulled a folder from the cabinet, flipping it open. Inside was a faded photograph of a young boy, maybe 6, with pale hair and wide, frightened eyes. Scrawled at the bottom, "Transferred, no other details." Ethan felt bile rise. "How many children?" he demanded. "Dozens," Caleb whispered. "Maybe more. The Bennetts covered it all. Rachel runs the money now, but there are others who handle the rest." Ethan's jaw tightened, his hands clenching into fists. He closed the folder with a snap. "This ends now." They gathered what files they could carry, snapping photos of the rest for evidence. As they left the warehouse, Ethan glanced down at Rook. The dog's gaze was steady, unyielding, as if to say he had done what was needed. Pulled truth from the shadows. That night, Clara arrived at the station after her shift at the hospital, carrying a thermos of soup she had made. Her eyes widened when she saw the stack of files on Ethan's desk, photographs of children staring out at them like ghosts. She set the thermos down, her hands trembling. "I knew it," she said, her voice breaking. "This isn't the first time." Ethan reached out, steadying her hand with his own. Rook pressed close to her leg, letting her rest her hand on his fur. In that quiet moment, Clara drew comfort not only from Ethan's steadiness, but also from the warmth of the loyal German shepherd, who had once again guided them toward the truth. The files spoke of horror, of names erased and lives stolen, but they also provided a path forward, and though the storm outside thickened, Ethan knew they had taken a vital step. Thanks to Rook, the first real evidence had surfaced. The snowstorm that had blanketed Maple Hollow showed no signs of slowing. By late afternoon, the town lay buried under a thick quilt of white, roofs sagging under the weight, trees bowing as if tired from carrying the cold. Inside the police station, heaters hummed loudly, but the chill in the air came not from the weather. It came from the files spread across the conference table, silent witnesses to lives stolen and futures erased. Ethan sat at the end of the table, his elbows braced, his hazel eyes sharp with the anger he worked hard to control. Beside him, Rook rested in a crouched position, the German Shepherd's ears perked, amber gaze watchful. Detective Ava Martinez leaned against the wall, arms crossed, her bobbed hair brushing her jawline as she scanned the copies of records they had gathered from the warehouse. Each photograph of a missing child deepened the crease between her brows. The sound of boots crunching on wet tile broke the silence. Chief Harold Mason stepped in, brushing snow from his coat, followed by a tall man in his early 40s, wearing a tailored navy suit beneath an expensive wool overcoat. His hair was chestnut brown, flecked with silver, combed back neatly, his pale gray eyes carrying a calculating glint. He was introduced as Thomas Reeves, an attorney representing the Bennett family. Reeves had the look of someone who thrived in boardrooms more than in small-town precincts, smooth-voiced, precise, and always aware of the weight of his name. Chief Mason, Reeves began smoothly, his tone practiced. I've come on behalf of Ms. Rachel Bennett. She wishes to clear her family of these appalling insinuations. His gaze flicked toward Ethan and Ava, sharp and faintly condescending. Dragging her family's name through the mud won't save children. It will only tear this town apart. Ethan stiffened. 2 infants were found abandoned in a dumpster, Mr. Reeves. And now, we have files proving dozens of children have disappeared under suspicious adoptions. That's not insinuation. That's fact. Reeves's lips curved into a cold smile. Facts can be interpreted, circumstances misunderstood. Rachel Bennett is a private woman, not a criminal mastermind. Before the argument could sharpen, the door opened again. This time, it was her. Rachel Bennett entered with measured steps, flanked by 2 aides who looked more like bodyguards than assistants. She was 37, tall and slender, with icy blonde hair pinned into a neat twist. Her blue eyes were striking, cold at first glance, yet beneath their frost lay something fractured, as though life had carved cracks too deep to hide. She wore a fitted charcoal coat and leather gloves, the attire of someone who never left the walls of privilege but carried its weight heavily. The room shifted with her presence. Ava's jaw tightened, Ethan straightened in his chair, and even Rook stood, his body rigid, hackles raised as if instinctively sensing the storm that had entered. Rachel's gaze swept the files spread across the table, her lips pressed thin, and she removed her gloves slowly, placing them neatly on the wood. "You think you understand?" she said softly, her voice carrying a restrained tremor. "You think a pile of papers tells you who I am, but you don't." Ethan rose to his feet, hazel eyes locked on hers. "Then, help us understand why children vanish while your name sits at the bottom of these records." Rachel's expression faltered, a flicker of pain shadowing her features. "Because legacy is a curse," she whispered. "Because I was born into chains you cannot see. My family built their empire not on timber, not on shipping, but on secrets. And when they died, those secrets became mine to carry." Ava's voice cut in, sharp. "So you carried on with the network instead of ending it?" Rachel's jaw clenched. "Do you think I had a choice? The estate was drowning in debt. The people who came to me with offers, they weren't strangers. They were the same men my father did business with. Walking away wasn't survival. It was suicide." The words hung heavy. Reeves shifted uncomfortably, but said nothing. Ethan studied her closely. She was not the picture of an untouchable villain he had expected. She was both perpetrator and prisoner, a woman shackled to her family's sins. Rook's low growl broke the silence. The German Shepherd's amber eyes fixed unblinking on Rachel. For a moment, her gaze met his, and something strange passed across her face. Fear, perhaps, or recognition that even an animal could see through the layers she wore. Chief Mason cleared his throat. "Ms. Bennett, regardless of your excuses, children are missing. If you know names, places, anything, we need it." Rachel hesitated, her gloved hands twisting together. Then she whispered, "Lena Williams." The name dropped like a stone into the room. She was my father's partner in all of this. When he died, she became mine. I didn't want her. But she controls more than you realize. Ethan felt the name lodge in his chest. He remembered seeing it in fragments across some of the files. Ava's dark eyes narrowed. Where is she now? Rachel shook her head. I don't know. She comes and goes, like smoke. She tells me what to sign, where to send money. If I resist, there are consequences. You think I'm free? I've been caged my entire life. For the first time, Rachel's voice cracked, the mask slipping. It wasn't absolution. Ethan knew better. But it was a glimpse of humanity under the frost. Reeves stepped in quickly, voice tight. This conversation is over. My client has cooperated to the extent she feels safe. He gathered her gloves, urging her toward the door. Rachel paused, turning her gaze back to Ethan. You can judge me all you want, Officer Cole. But until you understand, Lena, you'll never stop this. And then she was gone, leaving silence in her wake, the snowstorm outside pressing against the windows. Ava exhaled sharply. She's not innocent, but she's not the mastermind either. Lena Williams, that's our next lead. Ethan glanced at Rook, who still stood taut, every muscle tight. The dog's instincts were rarely wrong, and in Rook's unyielding stance, Ethan saw the truth. Rachel Bennett's shadow was only the beginning of something darker. The Bennett estate sat on the northern ridge of Maple Hollow, half hidden by the skeletal outlines of bare oaks and maples. Snow coated its crumbling stone walls, softening the jagged edges, but doing nothing to erase the sense of decay. The iron gates stood crooked on rusted hinges, their ornate design long tarnished. Once this mansion had been the crown jewel of Vermont aristocracy, a place of lavish parties and glittering chandeliers. Now it looked more like a mausoleum, a relic waiting to confess its secrets. Ethan Cole stood at the gate, breath clouding the frozen air, his gloved hand resting lightly on Rook's leash. The German shepherd's black and silver coat bristled, his ears rigid, amber eyes unblinking as they stared at the looming mansion. Detective Ava Martinez stepped up beside Ethan, her bobbed hair dusted with snow, her sharp eyes narrowed. It's more tomb than home, she muttered. The third figure with them, Clara Hughes, pulled her scarf tighter around her auburn hair, shivering as the wind swept across the ridge. Her green eyes flicked uneasily toward the towering structure. Clara had never set foot in a place like this. She had grown up modestly, had seen hardship in hospitals, not sprawling estates. Yet she felt a strange ache, as though the lives lost in the shadows of this mansion had left echoes she could already hear. The heavy creak of the gates startled her. Officer Daniel Price, a local cop assigned to assist, pushed them open. Daniel was in his mid-30s, a sturdy man with broad shoulders, short sandy hair, and a face perpetually set into a scowl softened only by his loyalty to the job. He wasn't known for brilliance, but he was steady and dependable, the kind of officer you wanted at your side when a door had to be forced or a perimeter kept. Together, the group advanced up the snow-choked driveway. Rook tugged forward, body taut, nose twitching with purpose. His instincts pulled them to the grand oak doors, which groaned loudly as Daniel forced them open. A rush of cold, stale air spilled out, carrying the must of decades of neglect. Inside, the mansion was a cavern of shadows. Dust sheeted over furniture, cobwebs hung in corners, and faded portraits lined the walls. Stern Bennetts with eyes that seemed to follow intruders. Ethan's flashlight beam swept across cracked marble floors and chandeliers, whose crystals had dulled to gray. The silence pressed heavily, broken only by the crunch of boots and the steady rhythm of Rook's paws. Place gives me the creeps, Daniel muttered under his breath. Ava, unfazed, focused on her notepad. Basement records say this estate had hidden storage rooms, likely where files or money were kept. They began the search systematically, sweeping the first and second floors before descending to the basement. The stairwell groaned under their weight, the plaster walls peeling as if shedding their past. The basement air was colder, damp, smelling of earth and rust. Their flashlights pierced rows of shelves lined with crates, leather-bound ledgers, and decaying furniture. Rook halted suddenly, his ears shooting upright. He gave a sharp bark, then pressed his nose against a section of the wall. Ethan crouched beside him, running a hand along the surface. His fingers caught on a seam, subtle, almost invisible. There's a door here, Ethan said. With Daniel's help, they forced it open, revealing a narrow passage. At its end lay a room untouched by dust. Inside, stacked neatly, were filing cabinets and boxes sealed with twine. On a table rested leather-bound books, their spines embossed with gilt lettering, still gleaming despite the years. Ava flipped one open. The pages contained lists of names, dates, and payments. Next to some names, a mark. Placed. Others were crossed out entirely. "This is it," Ava breathed. "Direct evidence. Not just adoptions, transactions." Clara stepped forward, her breath hitching as she scanned the records. She froze at a yellowed photograph pinned to a ledger, a line of children standing outside a shelter she recognized. Her voice trembled. "That's Maple Hollow Children's Shelter. I volunteered there years ago. These are the kids I played with, cared for. They vanished." Her knees weakened, and she pressed a hand to the table for support. Ethan moved instinctively to her side, his hand steadying her shoulder. "You couldn't have known," he said softly. But Clara's eyes brimmed with tears. "I should have asked more questions. I should have seen the signs. They trusted us." Rook nudged against her leg, as if reminding her of the present. His amber eyes seemed to say what Ethan's words could not. That blame belonged to those who profited from cruelty, not to those who had tried to give comfort. Clara rested her hand on his thick fur, drawing strength from his quiet loyalty. Ava continued to sift through documents, her jaw tightening. "Rachel Bennett's signature is on some of these, but the instructions, look here. They're signed with another name, Lena Williams." Ethan's hazel eyes darkened. "So, Rachel wasn't lying. Lena is the puppeteer." As they photographed and boxed up the evidence, a low sound echoed from above, a door creaking shut. Daniel stiffened, hand moving to his weapon. "We're not alone," he hissed, but after sweeping the upper levels again, they found only emptiness and silence, as though the house itself had sighed. Still, unease lingered. Someone had been here recently. By the time they emerged into the cold night, the sky had cleared to reveal a hard scatter of stars. The mansion loomed behind them, its secrets no longer fully hidden. In their arms, they carried files, photographs, and ledgers that could finally tear through the veil of power. Clara, walking between Ethan and Rook, looked back once at the silent estate. Her breath shuddered in the cold. "So many lost children," she whispered. "They deserve more than silence. They deserve their names spoken again." Ethan squeezed her arm gently. "We'll give them that. We'll give them justice." And in the unflinching gaze of Rook, amber eyes glowing faintly under the starlight, it felt less like a promise and more like a vow already set in motion. The evidence from the Bennett mansion had set the small police station ablaze with urgency. Files, ledgers, and faded photographs covered every table, and the sound of printers and ringing phones filled the air as officers scrambled to document what could become the largest case Maple Hollow had ever seen. Outside, the snow had slowed, leaving the streets glistening under pale moonlight. Ethan Cole stood near the map board, pinning photographs and strings of notes together. His hazel eyes were shadowed, exhaustion creeping into his face, yet the determination behind them burned steady. At his feet, Rook paced back and forth, muscles taut, ears pricked at every sound. The German Shepherd seemed to know that the hunt was reaching its peak. Detective Ava Martinez leaned over the files, her sharp eyes darting between pages. "Rachel's starting to panic," she said. "Reeves filed for her immediate departure from Vermont. If she runs, we lose leverage." Ethan's jaw clenched. "Then we don't let her run." Chief Harold Mason entered, looking heavier than usual, his stocky frame bundled in his winter coat. "State officials are circling," he muttered. "They want us to tread carefully, but there's no time. She's already making moves." As if on cue, Officer Daniel Price burst through the door, his sandy hair disheveled, his breath sharp from running. "Tip just came in. Rachel's prepping to leave from an old warehouse on the industrial strip. Black SUVs, armed men, the works." Ava grabbed her coat. "Then it's now or never." They rolled out in 2 vehicles, tires crunching over frozen roads, headlights slicing through the dark. Clara Hughes, though not an officer, had insisted on coming, her green eyes fierce despite the fear etched across her freckled face. She sat in the back of Ethan's cruiser, clutching a bag with supplies for the infants, just in case. Ethan had hesitated, but her resolve left no room for argument. The convoy reached the industrial district, a sprawl of corrugated steel warehouses half abandoned since the mill shut down. Their breath hung in clouds as they stepped into the icy air. Rook leapt from the cruiser, his black and silver coat shimmering faintly in the dim light, his amber eyes locked forward. Inside, the warehouse smelled of oil and damp cement. Shadows stretched long beneath the flicker of broken lamps. From somewhere deeper came the muffled sounds of hurried movement. Boxes dragged, voices raised. Ethan signaled silently, and they advanced. As they reached the central floor, the scene unfolded. Rachel Bennett stood near a black SUV, her blonde hair loose now, framing a pale face twisted by fear and defiance. Her expensive coat hung open, her gloves discarded. Around her, 3 men worked quickly, loading crates into the vehicle. One of them, tall and broad with a shaved head, spotted the officers and froze. His name, later identified, was Marcus Hale, a mercenary type known for odd jobs around the state. His demeanor was cold efficiency, a man who spoke little, but whose violence was never far beneath the surface. "Rachel," Ava called, weapon drawn. "Step away from the vehicle." Rachel's icy blue eyes flicked to them, then to the door behind her. Her hands trembled, but her voice was steady. "You don't understand. If I stay, Lena will bury me. If I leave, maybe I can survive." Ethan took a step forward, his tone hard but not unkind. "Running won't save you. It will only prove you knew everything. Help us, Rachel. End this." Her face cracked, pain flashing through. "I never wanted this," she whispered, then reached into her coat. In one swift motion, she pulled a pistol, her hands shaking violently as she aimed it toward the officers. The world narrowed. Ethan's pulse thundered. Ava tensed, her finger hovering on the trigger. Clara gasped from behind, her voice breaking. "Rachel, please, don't!" Before anyone could act, Rook surged forward like a blur of muscle and fur. His bark split the air as he lunged, jaws clamping onto Rachel's wrist. The gun clattered across the concrete floor, skittering out of a reach. Rachel cried out, stumbling backward as Rook held firm, careful not to maul, only to disarm. Marcus Hale moved suddenly, reaching for his own weapon, but Daniel Price was quicker. With a sharp command, he fired a warning shot that ricocheted off a steel beam, sending Marcus sprawling to the ground, hands raised. The other men froze, surrender spilling into their posture. Rachel sank to her knees, clutching her arm, sobs shaking her shoulders. "I never wanted this," she repeated, her voice raw, broken. Her hair fell across her face, hiding her expression, but Ethan saw enough. The crumbling of a woman who had been both perpetrator and prisoner. As backup officers swarmed in, restraining the men and securing the SUV, Clara stepped forward, her green eyes shining with unshed tears. She crouched near Rachel, her voice soft but steady. "Then stop letting them use you. Stop running. Think of the children. You can still make it mean something." Rachel lifted her gaze, tears streaking her pale cheeks. For a fleeting moment, regret burned clear in her icy eyes. She nodded faintly, her body sagging under the weight of surrender. Meanwhile, paramedics who had accompanied the convoy brought forward the twins, who had been transported for safety. Clara took them gently into her arms, rocking them as they whimpered softly against her chest. Her auburn hair fell forward, brushing their fragile faces, and for the first time in days, she smiled through her tears. Ethan stood nearby, his hazel eyes locked on the scene, the babies safe, Clara radiant with fierce protectiveness, Rook panting but proud, his amber eyes glinting in the dim light. Relief swept through him, fragile but real. Outside, sirens cut through the night, flashing red and blue against the steel walls of the warehouse. For the moment at least, Maple Hollow could breathe. The Bennett shadow was falling, and in its place, the faint glow of hope flickered to life. The trial of Rachel Bennett and her accomplices unfolded over the following weeks, stretching Maple Hollow into a place it had never been before, a town suddenly thrust into the national spotlight. Reporters crowded the courthouse steps, their cameras flashing against the gray winter skies. Yet, for Ethan Cole, Detective Ava Martinez, and Clara Hughes. The noise outside mattered far less than what lay quietly inside their own hearts, the fragile weight of the two infants who had survived against all odds. It was late February when the adoption hearing was held. The courthouse was packed, the benches filled with townsfolk who had come not to condemn, but to witness a rare spark of hope. At the front of the room sat Judge Ellen Draper, a woman in her early 60s with a calm presence, short-cropped silver hair, and glasses perched low on her nose. Known for her sharp wit and deep compassion, Judge Draper had spent her career fighting for children's welfare. She had no patience for grandstanding, but her eyes softened whenever her cases touched the lives of children. Ethan sat at the petitioner's table, his police uniform exchanged for a simple navy suit. The lines of weariness around his hazel eyes had eased somewhat, replaced by something steadier, something more vulnerable. Beside him sat Clara, dressed in a modest gray dress, auburn hair falling softly around her shoulders. She looked nervous, her green eyes shining with anticipation and fear all at once. Rook lay at Ethan's feet, calm but vigilant, his amber eyes watching every movement in the room. Though technically not a part of the proceedings, no one had the heart to ask him to wait outside. The infants lay in a crib near the front, attended by Nurse Valerie Owens, a woman in her 50s with warm brown skin and curly salt and pepper hair tied into a bun. Valerie was gentle but practical, known in town as the nurse who always carried peppermints in her pocket for anxious children. She smiled reassuringly at Clara, whispering, "They're in good hands, and they'll be in yours soon enough." The proceedings began with testimony from Mark Ellison, the county child services officer. His tall, gaunt frame looked more formal today in a suit that seemed one size too big. He spoke of Ethan's character, of his years of service, of Rook's heroism, and of Clara's tireless care in the hospital. Together, Mark concluded, they have not only saved these children's lives, but proven themselves capable of giving them a family. When Ethan rose to speak, his voice was low but steady. "I can't bring back the child I lost," he admitted, the room hushed by his vulnerability. "But I can honor that memory by making sure these two grow up safe, loved, and never doubting their worth. With Clara and with Rook, I believe we can give them that." Clara followed, her voice trembling at first but growing stronger. She spoke of her stillbirth years ago, of the grief that had nearly swallowed her, and of how these infants had given her a reason to heal. "They saved me as much as we saved them," she said, her eyes shimmering. "I want to spend my life giving them the chance to be more than what the world tried to make them." Judge Draper listened intently, her sharp eyes softening. After deliberation, she returned with her decision. "By the authority of this court, the guardianship of these children is granted to Ethan Cole and Clara Hughes. May they grow under your care with love, security, and dignity." The gavel struck, and the room broke into applause. Clara wept openly, leaning into Ethan as Rook let out a sharp bark, as if he too understood the gravity of the moment. Valerie handed the twins into their arms, and for the first time, they held them not as rescued victims, but as their children. The weeks that followed were not without challenge. Sleepless nights came quickly, filled with cries, bottles, and rocking chairs. Ethan learned to cradle one infant while burping the other, his broad frame surprisingly gentle. Clara, though exhausted, found herself smiling at 3 a.m, humming lullabies as the babies clutched her fingers. Rook patrolled the nursery each night, his ears flicking at every sound, often settling at the foot of the crib as a silent guardian. On Sundays, Margaret Fields visited with her knitted blankets, each one patterned differently. She carried herself tall despite her age, her kind blue eyes filled with pride. "They've given me back purpose too," she admitted quietly to Clara. "I thought my days of holding little ones were gone." The small family began to grow roots. Ethan built shelves in the nursery. Clara painted soft murals of trees and stars on the walls, and Rook claimed the rug by the window as his permanent watch post. Even Ava, hardened detective that she was, dropped by often with groceries or toys, joking that she was the children's unofficial aunt. Spring crept into Maple Hollow slowly, melting snow into rivulets that carved through the fields. On one bright morning, Ethan stood on the porch with one infant asleep against his shoulder, the other cooing in Clara's arms. Rook sat beside them, tail swishing gently. The air smelled of thawing earth and wood smoke from neighboring chimneys. "This is what I didn't know I was waiting for," Ethan said quietly, looking at Clara. His hazel eyes held warmth now instead of sorrow. Clara smiled, resting her head briefly against his shoulder. "Me too." For the first time in years, the house was filled not with silence, but with the sounds of life. Babies crying, laughter, the shuffle of paws across wooden floors. The ghosts of the past had not vanished, but they no longer defined the future. And so, under the watchful gaze of Rook, the loyal German shepherd with amber eyes, Ethan and Clara stepped into their new beginning. Not perfect, not free from the scars of the past, but whole in a way neither thought possible. This story reminds us that even in the darkest nights, God can send a miracle in the most unexpected way. Just like the officer, the nurse, and the loyal German shepherd found light through two abandoned children, we too can discover hope when we trust in His plan. Every day, no matter how ordinary, can carry extraordinary grace. If this touched your heart, share this story with someone who needs encouragement, leave a comment, and subscribe to our channel to hear more stories of faith and courage. May God bless you and your loved ones. And if you believe in miracles, write Amen in the comments below.